Thank you for joining the International Cooperative Governance Symposium for 2021. My name is Karen Miner, and I'm the Managing Director of the International Center for Cooperative Management at St. Mary's University in Canada. We are being joined by over 60 presenters from a dozen countries, plus we had over 200 people registered, at least for this launch session, which is just the beginning of the next 3 days. So for the next hour and a half, we're glad that this larger group has joined, and then we look forward for 3 full days with a smaller but still rather large group. Unfortunately, virtual. We would have loved to have hosted you here in Halifax, Canada. The symposium has been put on by a team, myself, Sonja Novkovic, Kian McMahon, and Aaron Hancock. You can see their pictures on the screen. You'll see them in Zoom video. And a lot of work has gone into this, not just the 4 of us, but all of you that are participating actively. So thank you. Also, a big thanks to a broader project that we're involved in out of KU Leuven University in Belgium. It's a multi-year cooperative governance project, and we're thrilled to be part of that. You can see where the funding comes from for that larger research project, FWO Belgium. And also for this symposium, we were thrilled to receive some funding from the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, which is helping with simultaneous translation and some other aspects of the symposium. So thank you to both. Erin, can I pass it over to you for just 2 minutes?
Yes, we want to certainly acknowledge the Indigenous territories on which we live. And hi, everyone, I'm Erin, as you saw in the previous slide. I'm the education manager. We are a diverse crowd coming from different communities and geographies. Speaking from a North American context, I want to recognize the lands of Turtle Island, home to many nations pictured here who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. These nations have been subject to violent colonization and dispossession from their lands. The International Center for Co-operative Management is located in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded traditional, ancestral, and never surrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Mi'kma'ki is covered by the 18th century peace and friendship treaties, which affirm Mi'kmaq sovereignty and title and enshrine a nation-to-nation relationship between Mi'kmaq and settler communities. Land is the root of justice issues. As cooperators committed to solidarity, human dignity, justice, and sustainability, Indigenous and settler reconciliation must be integrated into our work. I encourage you to consider whose lands you're on today, and if you'd like, you can add those to the chat now.
Thank you, Erin. And I know we're trying to fit a lot into the first 10 minutes, so a reminder to all of us to speak slowly with our simultaneous translated parts of this symposium. We will be providing a lot of follow-up information available to all after. So while you may be watching things and wanting to dig deeper or take notes, rest assured that we will make that available to you. A few quick comments on the International Center for Cooperative Management. We are the host of this event, and for those that are familiar with us already and likely engaged with us, this is just a quick refresher, especially for those for whom we may be new. So we consider ourselves to be leaders in values-based business education and research focused on cooperatives, credit unions, and mutuals. We take a very international view. We're very curious and interested in all types of co-ops in all sectors around the world. And the foundation of our center was the Master of Management in Cooperatives and Credit Unions, an online part-time master's program that was launched in 2003. Since then, the center has added in a graduate diploma and certificate option online. Again, all of this geared at professional business education for those working in or governing co-ops, credit unions, and mutuals. We are currently very engaged in governance research and have been for a number of years, as well as ongoing research in other areas. We do short courses. Now we've moved virtual for some of those, and in the past and hopefully the future, we love to travel other places and partner with people to do short courses on everything from member-centric governance and management to operationalizing the cooperative identity, 2 courses that will be offered this fall. And there are many other things. You can learn more about us on our website. You can follow us on social media, subscribe to our e-news, and of course, being part of this event. We really look forward to engaging with all of you in the next 3 days. Also, just a news flash, something that was quite active a few years ago was the International Cooperative Business Education Consortium. And some of you on this call were part of that consortium, a network of centers and institutions around the world that focus on cooperative business education. Just a heads up that we have decided to relaunch this, and we will be in touch with all of you that were part of it in the past. And if that piques your interest, please send Hanan an email to receive the information of upcoming meetings. And also a particular shout out and thanks to Sistema OCB, who has been talking with us as well in the last little while about how they can support the relaunch of this network. And we're thrilled to be working with them as well as others and connecting again globally on this topic. So quickly, why a symposium and why a symposium on this topic? Well, frankly, in 2013, and some of you hopefully were part of it, and I know you were, we hosted an in-person international cooperative governance symposium. It had the same title. It was in person here at the university, and we of course wish this one were again. So pre-pandemic, we had selected this date and we had started to plan the second symposium. It also again is very linked to this multi-year governance project that we're involved in with KU Leuven. So that's really been a helpful piece. And the theme for the next 3 days is governance in cooperatives, participatory, people-centered, and democratic, really coming at this from the perspective of governance as a system with structures, processes, and dynamics, and we'll talk more about that soon. So I won't go into more detail now, but just a reminder, this is what these 3 days are about, and this first hour and a half is really just a bit of a snapshot of what then is to come in more detail. So day one, for some of you, you're just joining for this first part, cooperative governance in context, that has 2 upcoming presentations and then ends with a panel. The rest of the day you can see on the screen, and for those that are engaging in all days, you would have your agenda in front of you and know what's coming. So I won't go into any of those details, but that after the hour and a half, we move into these other topics. Anyone that has joined for the public launch is welcome to join for any sections today or through the next 3 days. You can join and participate. You can come in and out, and then there's the core group that we know will be part of all 3 days. So we're going to move into what we're doing right now, and I'm going to first hand things over to Sonja Novkovic, who's doing the first presentation on cooperative governance, a humanistic approach. We will then move into Alexandra Wilson's presentation, a practitioner perspective on situational co-op governance, and then the final piece you see is where I'm pulling Sonja, Alexandra, and Martin Lowery together, and we will close off with a panel and a little bit of time for questions at the end, we hope. So please do, throughout all these sessions, be active in the chat, ask questions, make comments. I will be monitoring those during these next couple of presentations, and we'll see what we can pull in to supplement what's planned in the panel. So without further ado, I'm going to move away from this screen and hand things over to Sonja.
Thank you very much, Karen, and hello, everybody. My name is Sonja Novkovic, and I'm the academic director of the International Center for Co-op Management, working with this amazing team of people. You see Kian McMahon, who has been communicating with everybody, and you've seen and heard from Karen and Aaron as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce the cooperative governance from the humanistic approach and explain what it is we mean by that, and then lead you into what we'll be emphasizing and hearing more about from our amazing group of presenters through the day today and tomorrow and the day after. So what is the humanistic approach to governance? I will be speaking about the background a little bit. I'll say a little bit about what we mean by humanistic economics and management. These are actually fields. And then tell you how we are approaching governance in cooperatives, that it is about being contingent and not a cookie cutter kind of governance, and the governance systems that help us. So dividing into structure, processes, and dynamics helps us to identify what it is we're talking about when we speak about governance. So our understanding of what governance is written on this slide. The first line is a definition, right? This is from a dictionary. So it is to lead, to steer, be the head of, to set rules, be in charge of the power. But the ultimate goal of governance that we are interested in is to effectively fulfill organizations' goals in a way that is consistent with the organization's purpose. A part of that purpose for cooperatives is to actually survive as a cooperative and continue to operate long-term as a cooperative. So we start from this simple graphic to explain what a cooperative enterprise really is and how it's different. And I know that on this call, we have experts who are very much familiar with this, but we also have people who are maybe not so familiar with the cooperative model. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So the triangle in the graph there tells you that from the International Cooperative Alliance definition of a cooperative enterprise, there are cooperative values, cooperative principles, and the purpose of cooperatives is really to meet people's needs and aspirations. So it is very much a social and economic purpose. So the economic purpose comes from the tool, the means to actually meet those needs and aspirations. And the three inherent properties of cooperatives, the key characteristics that set them apart from alternatives, is that they are people-centered, they're humanistic, promoting human dignity, and they're members-based. So their members own the enterprise. What that means is that they're not capital-centered, like majority of our economy. Of course, we have other types of enterprise who are aligned and closer, sisters of the cooperative enterprise. But when we compare, usually we talk about the predominant investor-owned kind of economy and organization. And of course, the circles tell us that cooperatives are economic organizations that live in society and environment. So it's not internally centered, but it in fact needs to be considering the broader context. So people-centeredness is a key component of cooperative enterprise. Another one is that they're jointly owned and that they're democratically controlled. So in jointly owned and controlled and being democratic, this really is forming the nuts and bolts of what sets cooperatives apart as well. The joint ownership of an entity is really what marks or should mark good governance in cooperatives. And we'll speak to that throughout the day. And then again, democratic governance and what that means, and that it can be different in different contexts. Theoretical foundations matter, so we will be hearing about some, but basically here I'm listing what are theoretical foundations of governance in general. And one key aspect are property rights. Most governance systems and theories come from this asset ownership angle, if you will. And they are, so the property rights, the fact that you own assets, gives you the right to control the enterprise, and residual rights, meaning profit. So, whatever is left after contractual arrangements are completed. So these control rights and residual rights are the rights of ownership, right? And this is what then marks, who does what in an organization. It's also based on an assumption of human nature that is opportunistic. And this is the hallmark of neoclassical economics and most economics approaches. So, or dominant, I should say, not most, but dominant economics approaches. So that humans are opportunistic, they respond to economic incentives, and this is why they're in organizations. Transaction costs and transaction cost theories are important because they, who owns the enterprise is key, and who owns the enterprise depends on what is the least costly. So if it's very costly to contract with workers, maybe a worker-owned enterprise is the better way to structure. So this is Henry Hansman's theory and very influential approach. So really, who owns the business depends on transaction costs. And this is simply, again, economic reasoning. And then there is a separation of ownership and control in corporations that creates agency issues. So you have whoever owns the enterprise is not really controlling it on a daily basis. And this is why we have boards who represent the owners, who are hiring CEOs, who are executors of the wishes of the owners. And boards often are seen to have the role of monitoring and controlling the hired manager or CEO. There are alternative theories, of course, and some of them align with humanistic approaches. Stewardship is one of those, and stewardship simply looks at human beings as not just opportunistic at all times, but actually aligning with the goals of the organization. So stewardship is much closer to what cooperative enterprises ought to look like. And then there's the stakeholder theory that is also quite prevalent, also of interest to humanistic approaches. There's resource dependence that's often deployed in nonprofit organizations. So that means that your board role is to actually have connections and secure resources to continue to operate. And then the social network. So all these bits and pieces of different theories fit with what cooperatives need to worry about. But the second stretch of theories are more aligned with the humanistic approach that we are interested in. However, cooperatives are member-owned organizations, and being member-owned, they're first of all based in those cooperative values and identity that I mentioned, the ICA statement on the cooperative, the International Cooperative Alliance statement on the cooperative identity defines cooperative identity and values. And actually this year we are having a congress at the end of the year in Seoul, Korea, where ICA global membership of billions of people will be debating and discussing that identity and how important it is, especially in times like we're living in now. So this is one differentiator and the characteristic of cooperative enterprises. But it's really this relationship with the enterprise that is not about ownership. It is about the use of the enterprise. And by use, we mean you either work in the enterprise or you supply to it or you consume from it, right? So this usership is broadly understood to be directly involved with the enterprise that is a cooperative that you then control and own together with others. The voice and control of the enterprise is a personal right. The primary cooperatives, you have one member, one vote as a rule, and it's a personal right. It is not the right of ownership. And this is the key issue that is not distinguished enough in the theory and theoretical approaches. So voice and control is a personal right and not the right of ownership. And the residual is also not a profit where you minimize all the costs and try to maximize what's left for you, but it's patronage based. It's based on the amount of use. So if you work and there's a surplus made, not only do you decide how that surplus will be distributed, but when it's distributed to members, it is based on the hours worked, not on the amount of money invested in the enterprise. Another aspect is intergenerational stewardship. So cooperatives usually have indivisible reserves or undistributed surpluses. And that is what gives them a cushion for the future generations. So this intergenerational stewardship is an integral part of the model. Again, when we go back to values like solidarity, equity, equality, and so on, caring for others, like all these values actually speak to this concern for the future generation as well, and not just the current generation of members. There are stakeholder concerns as persons. If you're a consumer cooperative, you're not likely to be treating your workers poorly, right? Or you better not be treating them poorly, because those values that you espouse as an organization carry to human dignity of all involved, right? All human beings involved. And so that aspect of cooperatives is really important. Capital is absolutely instrumental. It's necessary and it's instrumental, but it is subordinate to people involved with the enterprise. So, and this actually is a principle of Mondragon worker cooperatives spelled out exactly this way. But we know that capital is a means to get to different purposes. So we need it, but it's not, it doesn't give you a voice. And separation of members from control, and note it's not ownership and control, but membership and control, Either there's none. If you're in a worker cooperative or a housing cooperative, you live there, you're there all day, every day, and you're involved in all of the above, usually. Especially small cooperatives of all types are seeing their members involved in governance and in management and in all operations, right? Or it could be weak in some cooperatives. This separation is there, but it's kind of weak separation, or quite severe, and pretty much looks like an investor-owned corporation. But it's contingent and it's situational. It depends on the type of membership. It depends on the type of cooperative. It depends on the size and all sorts of things. But this separation, as I said, is a key marker of the agency theory, which, we're not saying that there is no need for any control and accountability in cooperatives, but that the reasons why are different and they're not present in all types of cooperatives. So in a nutshell, when we talk about cooperative governance, we want to know how is human dignity, democratic control, and engagement of members and stakeholders safeguarded in co-ops as people-centered organizations. That should be the role of our decision-making within cooperatives. What structures and processes guide co-ops, right? So what structures of decision-making that enable members to actually have a voice and representation, and what processes are used in this democratic context? And how does cooperative organization change over time? Are those changes actually supporting the cooperative model and enabling its long-term survival, or are these changes actually detrimental to the survival? So where does the change come from is very important. And that actually marks, let me just pull it back, that marks the essence of the systems of governance in co-ops. But context, when we say that we're talking about contingent governance, I will just quickly mention some of those contingencies or situations and contexts that we're in, that membership type and the purpose of membership differs markedly between different types of, so again, if you have workers as members, or if you have community as members, or if you have consumers or producers, it's going to be very different how you'll govern and what their closeness to the enterprise really is. The insider or outsider status of members, workers, and as I said, housing co-op members are in the enterprise all the time, but consumers are really not. They're quite detached from the operations. What is the purpose of the enterprise? That is dramatically different as well. Why do members come together to organize as a cooperative? Is very different. Sometimes it's socially driven, sometimes it's financially driven, and so on. What is the stage in the life cycle? Are you just starting up? Are you growing? Are you mature? Will mark governance needs and structures. And then what is the size? Absolutely, it's critically important. Do we have non-member stakeholders? Yes, we do. Who are they? Competition, regulation, legal context, all of these things matter. And of course, culture and history, embeddedness in social systems. The purpose of membership is going to mark the structure, the systems of governance. What are the concerns of members? What needs protection? Member vulnerabilities are exposed. What are those? And how can a cooperative help protect them from those vulnerabilities? Current and future, that is. So climate change is an obvious one. Data and access to data would be another that we need to worry about. What constitutes cooperative health? How to prevent opportunism and by whom? And how to safeguard the purpose of the co-op are all the questions that relate to membership. So back to cooperative governance, it is again democratic governance in cooperatives, and that's shared with some other types of organizations. Not many, but in the social economy, yes, all of the social economy enterprises are democratic. And then structures, processes, and dynamics are the three elements that we talk about in the context of governance, in the systems of governance. So I'll just highlight one of the list here. So for structures, one key element of governance structures is the ownership, as I already mentioned. So if you look at any textbook on governance, first thing is who is the owner? And here we're talking about usership, as I already said, and that is critically different from the ownership angle, right? So if you need to use the cooperative to work there, your interest in its survival and in its sustainability is very different than it is if you're an investor who can pull your investment and take it elsewhere at any moment in time. But its democratic structures are about decision-making bodies, boards, committees, councils. So what do you have? How do you organize your decision-making, and constitutions, rules, and policies that are collectively decided on? The processes, democracy can be direct or representative. You can vote by majority, by consensus, by consent. We'll hear about all of these during the 3 days. We can have informal to formal processes depending on the size and so on. The governance system review is what many cooperatives use that really serves them well. But key to me here to mention is what I already said, which is that voice is a personal right, not a property right, and that is a key differentiator of what we're talking about. Dynamics and change, this is the third element, the third leg of the governance systems in cooperatives. And so this dynamics and change, what pushes cooperatives to change? Some changes are internal and emergent, and they evolve in conversations and relationships within the organization. Others are external, and there are many external pressures that actually force our leadership to think what they're doing and how they're doing on certain issues. But this isomorphism idea is really very important in cooperatives, that cooperatives morph, change over time, and they can change slowly, so you don't even notice that they've changed, depending on what influences us in decision-making positions. And those influences may come from professional best practice, and we see that often, that what is professional best practice does not have to be cooperative best practice. This is really the key danger that I think we need to address and do better on as academics and practitioners. So it could be professionalization, best practices. Isomorphism is largely external, but it can also be changing to come closer to the definition of the cooperative and cooperative identity. So that change is also absolutely possible, and part of what we are doing in education is addressing precisely that this change needs to push us into values-driven businesses and into spaces where cooperatives naturally fit. So here is my last slide to tell you what it is we're going to be hearing over the 3 days. We'll be hearing about theoretical developments and some humanistic approaches. That will be today. We'll then be talking about contingent humanistic governance practices in cooperatives, structures and processes that are compatible with humanistic governance in all types of cooperatives, and the solutions fit for different types of co-ops as well. So addressing the cooperative long-term health, humanism in purpose, joint ownership control, and democratic practices that are key differentiators of the cooperative model. And now I will hand it over to Karen to introduce our next speaker, because we'll be just lining up and having a conversation at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonja. And just so everyone's clear on the flow, I'm going to directly hand things over to Alexandra Wilson. Her presentation runs about 25 minutes. So if it helps you to turn off your video and stand up and stretch while you listen, I imagine everyone has ways to manage their Zoom fatigue as we go. And after that, we'll move into a panel. Do keep the comments coming. Notice some great ones. We're taking note of them. And I definitely would say some of those will come up again during the panel discussion at the end. So I will not do an introduction for Alexandra. She can say what she wishes about herself and her vast background and the many hats that she wears. But thank you, Alexandra, for being part of today's launch. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you, and I'll be changing your slides. So just feel free to say next slide.
Sure. Let's see. Now I seem to have the slide covered up. So just one moment here. Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, my talk may seem a little pedestrian after that very interesting introduction from Sonja, because Sonja is tackling things at the theoretical level, and I'm going to speak to the practical because that's my background. I'm not an academic. What I am is a practitioner. I have been involved with Cooperative since 1974, and I've played a variety of roles, volunteer roles and professional roles in a variety of consumer cooperatives, so housing, credit unions, a funeral co-op. I am on the board of the Co-operators, which is a very large insurance and investment management cooperative here in Canada. And I have served on the board of or managed several cooperative associations at the local level, at the national level, and through my participation on the board of the International Cooperative Alliance at the international level. In all of that, I've had experience, I've had a sort of very direct view of startups and long established cooperatives and cooperatives large and small. So that's given me, next slide, that's given me some ideas. And what I want to speak to today is what I call governance orthodoxies or sacred cows. So I'll just lay these out and then I'll be speaking to them. So first of all, about the board's role. So most people would say the board sets the ends and the management decides the means. Boards govern best by setting policies and holding management to account for results. And strategy is the board's province, operations, management's province. Next slide, please. Conventional thinking also holds that smaller boards are more effective. Directors should be recruited for their hard skills. That's a more recent trend, but I think it's already passed into the realm of conventional thinking. Term limits promote diversity, and staggered terms are desirable because they promote continuity. So these are the ideas that I want to, if you will, sort of take aim at today. I call them orthodoxies because they are received ideas that reflect conventional or normal ways of doing things for cooperatives and non-cooperatives alike, although probably all of these practices originated in organizations that were not cooperatives. So their fitness for cooperatives requires close examination, beginning with the role of the board. To start, let's ask why cooperatives have boards. The answer may seem so obvious as to render the question unnecessary. Unless your cooperative is very small, the members, that is the users, cannot operate it without paid help and cannot govern it, which includes supervising the paid help, without vesting some responsibilities in a subgroup of members. In other words, some responsibilities and the powers to carry them out must be delegated. The first delegation is to a board of directors, which then delegates some of its duties to a manager. This dual delegation gives rise to the question, what is the board's role and what is management's? The usual answer would draw a fixed line between board and management, assigning governance to the first and operations to the second. Putting it differently, we could say that the line demarcating the separate duties of board and management sits at the division between the ends that the organization seeks and the means by which it seeks them. This division finds expression in the following two norms. The board sets policy and management operates the enterprise within the boundaries those policies establish. The board decides strategy and management implements the strategy. But here there is a problem. The distinction between means and ends in the long chain of means and ends isn't always clear. And even if it is clear, a board can't always stick to the ends and delegate the means. This is more obvious in a smaller cooperative or one just starting out, but it holds true in large and mature cooperatives as well. To make this case, I will take a housing cooperative as an example of a small cooperative. Because they live in the cooperative, the members have a much closer relationship to the board and management than they would in, say, a credit union or a retail cooperative. Paradoxically, the distinction between what each one, that is, board and management, does is much less clear to the members than it would be if they had a more distant relationship with their cooperative. For instance, the members of a housing co-op will understand and accept that the board has delegated to staff the task of deciding who is eligible to pay a reduced rent based on their income. This, not because they agree that this is an operational rather than a strategic question, but because they can see right away the advantage of their neighbors not being privy to their personal information. However, if the board tries to explain a decision not to resurface the parking lot, which is full of potholes, by saying that as an operational matter, the decision was left to staff, the members will see the board as shirking its duties. They rightly believe that the board, as their elected representatives, is accountable for the co-op's operations, regardless of which duties may have been delegated and to whom. One might say at this point that to fulfill its accountability to the members while delegating duties to staff, the board can set policies to guide staff in making operational decisions. However, to try to govern wholly by policy is to try to govern by code or formula. That is, to anticipate the questions that will arise and to answer them in advance. The codes and formulas are inevitably limited in scope, and they are fixed, at least until changed. So they cannot anticipate all circumstances. This is perhaps why boards tend not to refer often to policies and demonstrate little ability to recall them, especially in my experience in larger cooperatives. So policies have their place, but they have less efficacy than we imagine. Drawing a hard line between the duties of the board and those of management is equally problematic for cooperatives in the startup stage. Seldom does a new venture have enough capital to hire people to do all the necessary work. What staff the startup can afford will need the active help of members of the board to get the enterprise safely off the ground. Who does what will be a function of who among the paid and unpaid participants has the requisite time and skills. There can therefore be no fixed formula to guide the division of duties. Probably no one will dispute this. But surely in a larger, securely established cooperative, one can draw a firmer line between governance and management. Can one? Let's assume that the cooperative has followed the strategy adoption versus strategy execution paradigm to draw the line between governance and management. First, it is famously difficult to distinguish between strategy and tactics, but let's try. Take these definitions found on the internet. Strategy is the overarching plan or set of goals. Tactics are the specific actions or steps you undertake to accomplish your strategy. That seems clear. But anyone who has framed up either a strategic plan or an operating plan knows that a strategy in one context is but a tactic in another. This year's strategic goals will guide this year's tactics, but are but tactics themselves when viewed in the context of the 5-year plan. Another difficulty is that strategy must be securely rooted in a strong knowledge of the enterprise and the environment in which it operates. How, if a board does not have a reasonable understanding of the business, can it elaborate a useful strategy for it? The answer is it can't. Luckily, most boards don't really formulate strategy. In practice, managements elaborate strategies and then test them with their boards, which may endorse them without change, adopt them only after making major changes, or tinker with them and then adopt them. How can a board arrive at a sufficient understanding of the business, or if the cooperative is an association of its affairs, to enable it at least to endorse a strategy and ideally to collaborate in its development? By taking a strong interest in the entity's business and affairs. This needn't imply meddling, but it does imply asking questions, as many as the board needs to ask, to enhance its understanding of the business and to test management's advice. Management teams that prefer not to be grilled will complain that the board is getting too operational, or more likely, they'll observe that those directors most prone to asking questions are straying from their governance role into management. Members of the board whose own understanding of the organization's business and affairs is weak may agree. However, a strong management team will welcome directors' questions, take pride in being able to answer them persuasively, and be thankful when the give and take of discussion leads to new insights and helpful corrections to management's plans and priorities. Even so, a board well versed in operations cannot set strategy independently, nor should it. After the startup stage, its real job is to question and to debate with management until a sound strategy is found. The board must then continue questioning management as the strategy is executed. Results become visible and the environment takes its actual rather than its anticipated shape. There are other reasons, legal and regulatory, why a board, even after delegating significant responsibilities to management, cannot remove itself entirely from the operational realm. First, under corporate statutes, including those governing cooperatives, the fundamental duty of any board of directors is to manage or supervise the management, and that's a quote, of the business and affairs of the organization. To be effective, oversight requires considerably more than receiving reports when the year is out and the results are in. It isn't enough to identify which goals were met and which were not. The board must understand how the successes and failures came about. Moreover, it must be present as the year unfolds, satisfying itself that results are emerging as expected and challenging management when they are not. Second, the statute law may vest the board with specific duties that are unmistakably operational. For instance, both Canada's Bank Act and the Insurance Companies Act require the audit committee to discuss with the internal auditor the effectiveness of the internal control procedures established for the company. Few would disagree that in the division between strategy and tactics, internal controls fall squarely under tactics. Finally, without any regard for the thinking that says that boards are responsible for strategy, not operations, regulators are increasingly relying on boards to ensure that the companies they govern are properly run and take no undue risks. They seek to locate accountability for the operation of the regulated entity within its board and will not accept as a defense that the duty to manage has been delegated to staff. In this behavior, it would seem that the regulators have joined those who believe that the board is an organization's strongest defense against failure. Is this not perhaps wishful thinking? Let me explain. The most important duty of a board is to hire and supervise the senior most staff member, whatever title they go by. Once the manager is in place, the board's hands are off the wheel. It may decide on the destination and even approve the route, but management is driving the car. The board's job is to make sure that the car stays on the road and that the driver gets the organization to its destination, making route changes and other adjustments as necessary, all while respecting the rules of the road. In the eyes of regulators, the board is not a passenger and the CEO is not a chauffeur. Rather, regulators' heightened and growing expectations would seem to cast boards in the role of co-pilot. There's just one problem. If we are in the car at all, we are sitting in the back seat. Our only recourse if the current driver proves unfit is to stop the car, at least briefly, and replace the driver with another. For very good reasons, that isn't something most boards want to do often. Before they do, they may resort to backseat driving for a time in their need to get the car to the destination. It is precisely because management is at the wheel and the board is not that most cooperative failures, indeed business failures generally, originate in the decisions of the people who run the business and not those who oversee them. Holding the board responsible does nothing to pinpoint where the business mistakes were made. Finally, insisting on a hard line between management and governance overlooks the role of management in ensuring an entity's effective governance. The responsibility, in other words, runs in both directions. No one here would be surprised to hear that in investor-owned corporations, management plays a part in finding suitable persons to join the board of directors. In cooperatives, we tend to see this as a heresy that flies in the face of democratic control. It doesn't. Real democratic control requires that a board be effective. Management in a cooperative can help by nudging some people to run for the board and discouraging others. In a small cooperative, such as a housing or daycare cooperative, this can be crucial in mending weak governance. Even in a large cooperative, management can and should give the board advice on how to do its job. So here are a few conclusions one might draw from these observations. The proper division of responsibility and degree of delegation within a cooperative will be strongly influenced by the cooperative size and stage of development. In this sense, there is no best practice. The need to delegate duties arises mainly out of size and secondarily out of the requirement for specialized expertise. So for instance, in a very small housing or worker cooperative, the board can and should comprise the entire membership. The real line between the board's duties and those of management is jagged, malleable, and permeable, rather than straight and fixed. It will reflect the cooperative specific circumstances rather than a strict or precise compartmentalization of powers. As circumstances change, the line can bend and be reformed without breaking. And regardless of where it lies, circumstances may require exceptions. The board may sometimes have to step in and do management's work and vice versa. This is not to say that boards should not establish clear expectations of their cooperatives management. They should. And unless circumstances dictate otherwise, they must also avoid doing what the cooperatives managers are paid to do. All right, let's turn to the board's composition, starting with its size. For a number of years, the trend has been towards smaller boards, presumably on the grounds of streamlined decision-making and economic efficiency. Though too many boards make the decision to shrink on the grounds that boards are smaller these days. But in fact, there is no optimal size for boards generally. The right size for an individual cooperative depends on its size, type, and stage of development. Startups need working boards, as I was suggesting earlier. This argues for smaller, though not necessarily small, boards populated only with those who either are prepared to roll up their sleeves or can bring a cooperative business or credibility with an important public, such as a funder or regulator. Association boards need to be representative, which, depending on the circumstances, may require them to be rather large. For instance, the board of our apex body in Canada, Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, needs to balance Canada's 2 official language groups, include a diversity of types of cooperatives, and reflect a geographic mix. Same is true of the cooperators, as a joint undertaking of more than 40 cooperatives serving a broad policyholder base in 10 provinces and 3 territories. Both organizations also want good gender representation, and they want to reflect, to the extent that numbers allow, the demographic diversity of the Canadian population. To meet all these requirements, they will need large boards. This should go without saying, but for those preoccupied with best practices, it does not. The size of the board must take account of the size of the membership the cooperative draws its leaders from. For example, it is hard to fill a larger board in a housing cooperative with people who have the time, the willingness, and the ability to contribute effectively. A board of 7 may be just right, while a board of 10 may be continually hard to keep filled. In larger cooperatives, including credit unions, a bigger board will offer greater room for diversity. Many cooperatives have been slow to respond to calls for gender parity because they don't want to displace their current directors. Faced the same problem when they were required by law to fill at least 40% of their board seats with women, many European businesses, including cooperatives, met the new rule without difficulty, simply by adding seats to their board. As long as a cooperative isn't small, a larger board also aids in recruiting good talent. When the cooperatives had a 20-person board, it's 22 now, the then CEO complained to me privately that it was too large. I retorted that with a board that large, he could count on having at least 10 good directors at one time, which was enough to get the job done. I was, of course, exaggerating for effect. Perhaps we had 14 good directors. My point is that no matter the size of a given board, one can never count on every member contributing effectively. So when one designs the board, one should apply a small multiplier to the size that otherwise suggests itself. One way you can do that is to specify in the bylaws some flexibility in the size of the board. What about director qualifications? Here, the current trend, both within and without the world of cooperatives, is towards recruiting directors for their hard skills. While that is an improvement on whom you play golf with, it falls short. For one thing, it reflects a view of the board's responsibility that is at odds with the desire to maintain a firm distinction between governance and management. Perhaps cynically, I sometimes think that boards want to add experts to their ranks so that the other board members will not be obliged to learn enough about a technical subject to be able to assure themselves that management has the area in hand. More important, the skills matrix approach overlooks the greater importance in contributing to a director's effectiveness of what I will call soft qualities, such as courage, candor, judgment, insight, diligence, persistence, discernment, rigor, persuasiveness, an independent mind, and the ability to work with others. By narrowing the selection of qualified candidates, the matrix approach may even lengthen the odds of getting the necessary soft skills. Just as problematic, by introducing more filters into the selection of directors, recruitment for skills works against gender parity and slows progress towards greater demographic diversity. Nomination committees, by placing too much emphasis on professional skills and reducing competition, can have the same effect. On that theme, in a bid for greater diversity, term limits have become commonplace, but do they really promote diversity? In theory, they do, by freeing spots on the bench. In practice, they can work against achieving diversity in the senior ranks of the cooperative movement. Women and members of underrepresented groups who tend to ascend more slowly to positions of power often time out on their primary board and so step down early or cannot reoffer for the boards their primary board led them to. Term limits do have a place, but their place is not everywhere. They are vital in housing cooperatives, for instance, where board members can become entrenched and hard to displace without conflict, leading to dissension and ineffective or even corrupt governance. Remember, however, that term limits are essentially management's friend. They allow a manager facing pressure from their board to wait out the directors they perceive as difficult. That can be a good thing or a bad thing. Staggered terms are another popular measure, normally rationalized on the grounds of continuity. Though a useful counterbalance to term limits, there seem to me to be two knocks against them. First, they are devilishly difficult to manage, absent a professional corporate governance staff, especially if the board has other structural features such as regional representation. Second, they make boards revolution-proof, which may be the reason they were first introduced. While continuity is normally desirable, sometimes we need a revolution. For instance, to replace a corrupt or ineffective board, to achieve gender parity on a reasonable timetable, or to induce a leap forward in diversity and inclusion. All right, so what does this all tell us? You can show my next slide now, I think. There we go, good. All right, in designing your cooperative's governance, you need to, first of all, think. Try to work from first principles. Distinguish between what I would call trends and genuine best practices. Most of what we call best practices are really just trends. They're what other people are doing. And so make conscious choices. And making conscious choices means making trade-offs between competing needs and goals. You can't have it all, not at one time in any case. And then lastly, review the governance practices from time to time and rethink, go through that process again. So that's what I wanted to say today. I had originally wanted to say a little bit more about some of the challenges associated with the cooperative's democratic character, but time will not permit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. And as we will be going into a panel, including you and Sonja and Martin, there may be time to bring up some additional points in our final half hour together. So we are going to just move directly into a panel. As I just mentioned, Sonja and Alexandra are part of that. And I would welcome Martin Lowery to the stage. If you want to show your video, Martin, and Aaron will make sure you're pinned. And just a quick couple of words about Martin Lowery for those that don't know him. He's the Executive Vice President Emeritus of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, NRECA. Rolls off the tongue a little more easily. He's also an inductee into the US Cooperative Hall of Fame. He's on the board of the International Cooperative Alliance. He served many years on the board of the National Cooperative Business Association, NCBA-CLUSA in the US, as well as the National Cooperative Bank in the US. And I'm sure that only really scratches the surface of the many things that Martin has done in his career. And I'm so thrilled that he was able to join today and be part of this last piece with a panel. And I'm moderating this panel. We have some questions. Going to start with the first one and hand the mic over to Martin in just 1 minute. So continuing on with the theme around cooperative governance, let's talk about the three parts of the theme of this symposium, which was people-centered, democratic, and participatory governance. So what, in your view, Martin, are these characteristics in terms of being fundamental to strong cooperative governance?
Thank you very much, Karen, both for the introduction and the question. I listened very closely to both Sonja and Alexandra, and I think there's a common ground between the theoretical and the practical, and it fundamentally comes down to membership. Let's contrast this quickly with the investor-owned world. What does a board member on an investor-owned company really think about? What do they think they're accountable for? Well, fundamentally, it's return on investment. And that leads to what we can talk about as the tyranny of the quarterly phone call to the shareholders, which tends to force you into short-term thinking. Contrast that with, regardless of size or sector, the role of the board in representing the interests of the membership itself. That interest is markedly different than in the investor-owned community. I've worked with boards that have lost their way in terms of failing to recognize that their election of that board by the membership gives them only a responsibility to focus on the accounting, on the bottom line operating statement, and finally on protecting the assets of the organization, all of which are very important, but really don't necessarily get to the question of connecting to your membership and understanding the needs and interests of the membership. If we go back to the purpose comments of Sonja, that's fundamentally what we're talking about. How do you truly represent the interests of the people who are your members? And you yourself are typically going to be a member as well. You're elected by the members. You have a responsibility to them. So losing sight of that, it's easy to lose sight of the direction of the cooperative overall. And so I'll stop there because I know we have a lot of other things to talk about as well.
Thanks, Martin. Now, Alexandra, was there anything that you wanted to add, again, back to the principles of people-centered, democratic, and participatory that you felt you might not have gotten out in your presentation, and those words that you wanted to add to Martin's comments?
Well, something came to mind as I was listening to Martin. So in a cooperative, at least in theory, you have a very tight accountability loop because the members, in other words, the owners of the enterprise, are also the users of the enterprise. And management sits in the middle, overseen, of course, by the board. Whereas in an investor-owned corporation, the investors are over here and the consumers are over here. They are two different, fundamentally different stakeholder groups, though there may be some overlap between them. So you don't have the same accountability loop. But I think what happens in cooperatives too often is that we forget this, and this happens typically as cooperatives grow larger and more successful. So they are adopting the practices of the world around them, and of course, sometimes this is because they introduce people who come from the larger world around them as they try to find the right talent. But you know, it's not even that necessarily. It's about this innate human quality of following conventions. You know, this is where isomorphism comes from. It's not because you brought some intruders into the organization from the private sector. Your own people who've grown up in your organization will be fundamentally influenced by what they see in the world around them. So that leads to odd, well, not odd situations. And of course, that can lead to a fundamental deterioration in the cooperative, where it's no longer really purpose driven, but it can emerge in rather small ways. I sat on the board of what is now Van City Community Investment Bank, and at every meeting, 4 meetings a year, we would get a report on legislative changes and class action suits and just things going on in the legal realm that might affect our bank. Well, it was a gold mine because we've got this list of class action suits. You know, here's a class action suit against American Express for doing this, or against this bank for doing that. And at one meeting, I said, well, look, why don't we? This is incredibly useful. Why don't we look at the list of class action suits and say to ourselves, right, consumers don't see that as in their interest. Let's stop doing it. they looked at me like I was from Mars. Well, like, why would you do that? You know, like I was a traitor because I was taking the side of the consumers rather than the business entity. Well, in a cooperative, the whole point of the business entity is to serve its consumers, you know, whoever they may be. Yeah.
So Karen, could I add one point on this question? I think that what Sonja said about intergenerational stewardship is really, really important. You think about the issues we're facing globally today. Let's just take one example as climate change. And there are many others. Intergenerational stewardship is a fundamental responsibility of that board of directors. That's not necessarily easy for a board member to understand or to be able to grasp in any practical sense. But if it's seen as a critical characteristic of an effective cooperative governance system, I think we change the world fundamentally.
Thanks, Martin. Great add-on. We definitely talk a lot about this intergenerational aspect of co-ops, and even that the current members, they're there on behalf of past members and future members and going beyond memberships as well. And that's a very difficult thing to think clearly about, even though we need to in our governance systems. Yes, Alexandra?
If I just add a word to that, I think that's very true. And I think it's actually a special problem of cooperatives. I think cooperatives struggle with the concept of fiduciary duty because they think in terms of when they think like cooperatives at all, in terms of their current membership and what their current members need from them, what they owe their current members. This idea that the board has responsibility for the perennity of the organization, that the fundamental fiduciary duty is owed to the entity and not any specific group of individuals at any one time is difficult sometimes for cooperatives. And I call it the problem of the horizon. Then you also have a problem with the scope of fiduciary duty, because sometimes cooperatives think that their only duty is to their members, but they may be serving a public beyond their members. This would be the case at the cooperators, for example, where the majority of our policyholders are not members, because our members are all organizations, not individuals. And there are other stakeholders, most notably the employee group, but the stakeholders go beyond that. So in an insurance cooperative, policyholders are stakeholders. So I think this is something that merits more discussion and exploration when we're talking about cooperative governance.
Thanks, Alexandra. So everyone that's here for 3 days, please keep all of these points in mind. This launch is just the warm up. So I can see I'm already going to have a challenge working us through these 4 questions that we pre-planned, but that's always the generative nature of these sorts of panels. I'm going to move to the next question, and you'll see a little changing location for me because I need to invite Sonja back up to the stage too to be part of this. But I will start again with you, Martin, in 1 minute. And the question is, when we look across the sector, there are well-established co-ops that have created amazing cooperative governance systems. So sometimes it's easier for us to point to all the ones that are problematic, because we do see others leaning into more of the non-cooperative governance approaches that aren't a fit for our model. And we've talked plenty about that already. So can you name one example of what you see as an amazing cooperative governance system?
Oh, that's an easy one for me. I had the privilege of working with the creation of Kauai Island Utility Cooperative in Hawaii. It was an acquisition of an investor-owned company, and it was a revelation to the citizens on the island of Kauai that cooperatives even existed. There was very little cooperative activity. It took 3 years to do the acquisition, but in the process, we created an interim board of directors so that the co-op itself could purchase the assets of the investor-owned company. What is amazing to me is the education process resulted in the citizens of the island of Kauai really taking heart at the sense they had that the cooperative was truly a community-based organization. And so the management, understanding that the board had a very important role to play in strategy, began a listening operation with the board members around the island. This was in 2002 when they were first created. And out of that process, it became quite clear that renewable energy was the single most important issue on the minds of the members. The island was served by diesel, which is true of many islands around the world. Electric generation is primarily diesel generation. And the board listened, management listened, and they are now getting close to 50% renewable energy and have a goal of reaching 100% by the early 2030s, which will be many years ahead of the mandate that's been put in place by the state of Hawaii. That board of directors is incredibly active. They're the election process every 3 years, and they are staggered terms, as Alexandra talked about. Has many people running for the board, great deal of interest in it. And yet, very interestingly, they have stayed out of operational issues. That can be a problem, as Alexandra talked about. Well, there's no bright line, you can still cross over. But I believe they really understood their role because they understood the nature of a community-based membership, locally owned and locally controlled organization. And it's been a great, great success.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to actually turn it over to Sonja, since she hasn't spoken up yet with this panel. Is there an example that we haven't talked about yet that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, and you will notice we're in the same room, but switching places for microphone sharing issues. So bear with us. Yeah, so in thinking about this and what examples to give, I will mention briefly two, actually. To me, the good governance in cooperatives are the ones that really draw our attention, are the dynamic ones, the ones that are really revisiting, reviewing, correcting, changing with the times and issues, right? So how do you manage these dynamics and not ruin the co-op? Well, OAS Credit Union, which we have as a case study on our website, I'm sure Aaron will share. So OAS Credit Union in Washington, DC is really a really interesting case of member engagement through committees. So, you know, there is a board, but these, I can't remember now the number, 9 committees, is really drawing on a group of 60 members in a credit union, which is quite fascinating. And they do the work of governance. So it's really amazing. And with this, you know, influx of opinion and diversity and you know, stories, you actually get the dynamic and change. So that we have it written as a case study, but the one we don't, and we will, is SAOS. I want to mention them. This is Scottish Agricultural Organisation Society in Scotland, agricultural second tier cooperative. What I love about them is that their members are farmer cooperatives, and they look at their member vulnerabilities to be a step ahead of the members in helping them navigate new challenges that are coming. So climate change has been on their agenda for decades, and they've been working with their members and educating their members in where they need to go. So, you know, not only are you not just responsible to members right now, but you also have issues that members may not see sometimes what's coming. And so that guidelines and that vision is really important. And one thing that they also did, I mentioned this in my previous talk, or in my earlier talk, sorry, that they looked at data as an issue. So they recognized that actually the ownership of data of their farmers was in the hands of IBM, the hardware provider. And so nobody knew. So once they started digging, they realized that the government didn't know, nobody knew. So they figure out, they actually put together a multi-stakeholder cooperative with all so the government needs to know, you know, in case of public health issues, they need to use the data for that purpose. And there are other stakeholders who need to use the data, but farmers now own the data and are saying how the data will be used, and they're very much aware of where it's going. So SAOS initiated this change and started a new cooperative to help their members actually understand where they're vulnerable and where opportunities may harm them. So these are the sorts of things and sorts of stories we want out there. to show that it's really this concern for members and society that drives some interesting and innovative solutions in cooperatives.
Thank you, Sonja.
Thanks.
I'm conscious
You're
of
coming back here?
time, and I will fast forward us a little bit in hopes that we give a few minutes for a few other voices, perhaps for the audience. So I would just say, if you have a specific question that you want to make sure you ask, then please raise your hand. I will probably only be able to pick a few people. Before I do that, though, I'm going to quickly just ask Martin, if you were to pick one thing as a biggest threat to the cooperative sector, if we don't have fit for cooperative governance systems, what would that be?
It's been mentioned by both Sonja and Alexandra, and that is isomorphism. The idea that ultimately, as you mature as a cooperative, you feel that you need to take on a more professional context, environment, and you look to the other side and decide that the best practices of corporations, investor-owned companies, is where you need to go. You start to look at executive compensation. You start to look at compensation of the board as a professional board. And that path can unfortunately lead to dissolution or more likely becoming a stock-held corporation. It's happened all over the world. It happened in Canada very recently. It's happened in the United States. I think that's the greatest threat. And the greatest opportunity to avoid that threat is to recognize the value system and the principles by which you should live as a cooperative. And let me just transition quickly, because I think it's relevant to this question. There have been a number of comments on the chat room or in the chat room about the role of the board chair and the relationship between the board chair and the CEO. Where I have seen the problem of isomorphism come up most commonly, it's when both the board chair and the CEO see the world the same way and believe that they need to move away from practicing the cooperative model itself and move on from there. That relationship between the chair and the CEO is absolutely critical to everything we've talked about, including knowing where that balance is between operations and governance, between management and governance. So great comments in the chat room in that regard.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I know that resonates hopefully with all, and there's so many twists and turns in the topic of isomorphism, and it's a large topic. I think a key element we need to put more emphasis on in the cooperative sector as well is our principle number 5 on education, training, and information. There's ongoing need there, given the lack necessarily of knowledge and understanding of the model. And without that, this continues to happen. However, there's so many, I mean, that's a deep topic. I know it's a familiar word and one that we use, and many in the Canadian sector are using even more and more. I just was on a Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada event this week where Paul Hanna from the Co-operators was throwing out the isomorphism word. It's become, a key part of the lexicon, it seems, in the past years, at least more so in North America, maybe beyond. So I'm going to save the last question for the end, hoping we have just a couple of minutes in the final minutes for a wrap up. So you all know what that is, those on the panel. And I'm going to turn over to the first hand that went up. Please feel free to show your video if you're going to ask a question, or anyone, please show your video. We'd love to see more faces in these final minutes. But Anu Pusa from Finland, do you put your hand up? So if you want to jump in with a comment or a question, we'd love that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the panelists. Very interesting discussion, and in the chat room. My question for you is that what is your take on the concentration of power? I mean, if we have moral and skilled leaders, they are experts and they are operating according to the cooperative mission, I assume it's not a problem. But then again, it kind of goes against the democratic principle if it's very concentrated. So there are cons and pros, but what is your take on this? Thank you.
Are you saying
who wants to
power
jump
in
in?
the boardroom?
Martin.
Go ahead, Martin.
Well, if it's a concentration of power in the boardroom, that's the exact opposite of what I was talking about in terms of being member-centric or people-centric. If it's concentration of power in the CEO or general manager, that's where things go badly wrong. And that's where the board has a critical responsibility to ensure that that does not happen.
You're muted, Karen.
Say
That
again.
was Sonja
That was
muting
me
our main
doing.
room. Stop muting me, Sonja. Alexandra, did you have something to add?
And I'll resist the temptation.
Okay.
Let's go to the next
Yeah,
question.
there we go.
Okay, I'm grabbing a question out of the chat since I think it takes us in a different direction, an important one to raise. So it's Abe who has asked, what role does critical analysis of power and oppression in the larger society and within co-ops play, I gather? How can we create equality in governance and equity in distribution for reparative systems, so reparation? Alexandra?
Well, I'll have a go at it. I think I'm not sure that's the most helpful way to look at the problem, because I think that the real problem isn't so much about power relationships as it is about isomorphism, which we were just talking about. It's tempting to look at it in terms of distribution of power, but watching how cooperatives actually work in practice, how people who are imbued with what I would take to be the right values, with an appropriate degree of idealism, how they then govern and operate their cooperatives. I think that what we're really up against is this tendency of human beings to want to follow what other human beings are doing. And without sort of going off on a long tangent here, this speaks to our very nature. This is a biological trait. It's an adaptive trait. You know, we live in groups, and groups need norms in order to stay together. And individual members of the group need advice from the group on how to behave in every element of behavior in order to survive. So it's very strong, and it goes way beyond, it infects everything, you know, the way we do everything. So what's the remedy? I mean, if cooperatives were the dominant organizational form or enterprise model, that would be great, because we could establish the right practices and then everybody would sort of fall in with that. But we aren't, and we aren't likely to be anytime soon at any rate. So the remedy is to be very conscious of this and to think, to ask ourselves always whether we are doing this because it's the conventional way of doing it, or whether because it's going to take us to the ends that we seek. And I like to think that if that habit is strongly inculcated, then we can defeat or at least moderate this tendency simply to copy the dominant models around us. Yeah, so, but this is a bit, in a little, you know, to some extent, this is a bit of a philosophical question. That's my own view. I think this is the real problem, rather than a problem with distribution of power.
We can move on to another question unless Sonja or Martin want to chime in on the question of power and oppression and how co-op governance helps to create equality and equity of distribution in these systems.
Just quickly, I think I maybe missed Anu's point, which is it's a very large societal issue, and governance at the largest level of governance globally. And we can see that concentration of power happening in autocracies. We can see it happening even in democracies that are debating the effectiveness of community-based thinking. So if I get that question correctly, then the idea that a larger impact of cooperatives locally thinking globally would be very good for the world. And I think we do have to do both. We're thinking about this in relationship to the Congress in Seoul. We're coming together as a global community, and we know the serious issues that have to be addressed in a post-pandemic society. And the question ultimately becomes how impactful can cooperatives be in reducing that concentration of power and returning more of that power to the people who deserve it, need it, and will not survive without it.
Thank you, Martin. Great addition. Quick thought, Sonja?
Yeah, quick thought. I'm thinking, I like to say that cooperatives are as radical or as conservative as their members. And this is exactly, the thing. It's a reflection. What co-ops do is a reflection of membership and when members' education levels and thinking and so on. So societal trends and issues come to the fore. Cooperatives were not great at preserving the environment, even though we had the values and the principles. Cooperatives were not great at, spreading equity, equality always, right? But what cooperatives are good at is carrying the torch or promoting a community or enabling and empowering a community of people, right? As Alexandra is saying, it's a social group, really. So we had these conversations, or we're having them more and more because it's time to have them. And it seems that promoting cooperative development among marginalized groups is where we are starting. And I think it's a great start because it's shared values, shared norms, shared cultures. The question then, as Jessica Gordon-Amhart pointed out, is how do we talk to each other? So right now we are developing in silos. And I think it's a good step because, again, you're empowering people who maybe didn't have the power. Now the question is, how do we talk to each other? And we can do it through, again, values and principles of cooperation, through even, supply chains and principle 6, co-op to co-op, everything, support, trade, association, and so on. So through associations, through the means and the structures that cooperative systems and movement has, I think we can do a good job of it. But first, I believe that promoting and helping communities that are marginalized to, in fact, build their own, the way they see it and want it, right? Within the culture that makes sense to them is the first step. And that seems to be picking up.
Okay, great. We're down to our last 5 minutes where we need to be finished. So I will go to the last question and ask for a quick thought from each of the panelists before we close off for those that are leaving us at the 1.5 hour mark. So really, it's that if you have to boil it down to some essential advice for cooperatives in terms of cooperative governance, what advice would you have? Who wants to take that on first? Alexandra?
Well, yeah, here I'm going to repeat myself. I think that one has to think all the time, and practices can be put in place to facilitate that. So if I look at the cooperators, there are a couple of really good things that we do that keep our governance properly aligned with our cooperative nature. One of those is a regular democratic structure review where we take on, in a formal way, we examine our governance structure and our governance practices. Now, that sounds terrific. Of course, what tends to happen is people say, oh, you've got this huge boards are smaller these days, the board should be smaller. But then we debate the issues and we land on something. And usually we land in a good place. So it would be easy, and a lot of cooperatives, I fear, just it's easy to just say, oh, this is the way we do things, and not to give them any critical examination. So a formal process where you regularly examine how you are governed can really help, I think.
Thanks, Alexandra. And that is a fabulous example, and one that we hope to even write up in a case study with the cooperators, because it's such a great reflective process that you take on as a regular part of your work. Martin, your thoughts in terms of advice?
Education. We're not born board members.
Yeah.
A lot of board members are elected to the position and really don't have a sense of what their roles and responsibilities are. We have so many opportunities throughout the world for training programs. around governance and effective governance. Take advantage of them, budget for them. You know, every board member once a year, take advantage of an educational opportunity that the cooperative will fund.
Thank you, Martin. Well, I'm going to just wrap this up unless Sonja.
Can I have a quick advice?
Okay, it's quick.
It's a quick
Okay.
advice. Hire managers who actually understand the cooperative business model.
Yes.
That would
yes.
be my advice. And
Absolutely.
if you don't have one, ask yourselves why. Put the money into management education for cooperative leaders, because we really can use some. So that would be my take on it.
Thanks, Sonja. Yes, that acknowledgement that it is a different business model, both
Yeah.
from how it operates and how it is governed, and that knowledge, if one does not have it, it takes work. I speak from experience. It takes ongoing work, and you're never done learning. I know there was a lot of great conversation going on in the chat on the side as well. Again, a testament to how this is a group of experts coming together, even to think about cooperative governance. And so we'll be a reminder, we'll be putting a report together of this entire symposium. So if you're only here for an hour and a half, or if you're here for 3 days, we'll be providing lots of fodder afterwards to help you synthesize and continue to think about this. For those that have just joined for this hour and a half, thank you for participating in this part. If you're here for all 3 days, well, don't go anywhere. And I just want to respect everyone's time and say that we're wrapping up this launch of our 3-day International Cooperative Governance Symposium. Thank you to Sonja, Martin, and Alexandra for being part of this with me and the International Center to get things rolling.